Every running light on the Tartarus was burning when we brought the shuttle alongside. That was the first wrong detail. A carrier-class vessel adrift for 10 years after a failed experimental fold space jump should have been dark and spent, a dead mass with cold plating and no habits left in it. Standard wreck profile. Instead, the Tartarus waited in open space like a ship holding at dock. Guidance strobes cycling through approach patterns, docking clamps extending toward our hull before we had transmitted a single handshake code. "She's reaching for us," Pete Navarro said from the co-pilot seat. He did not sound alarmed. Pete and I had worked deep space recovery together for 9 years, and we had seen stranger things than an overactive docking system. Tankers venting atmosphere in spirals, mining rigs whose automated tethers still snapped at anything crossing their proximity radius. Equipment remembered its job long after the people who had issued the orders were gone. Still, Pete watched the Tartarus's clamps track our approach through his viewport, and his hands paused above the thruster controls. I took the Tartarus contract because my brother Danny had been on the crew manifest when she jumped. 47 people aboard an experimental fold space carrier, every one of them listed by the company as unresolved because the ship had never transmitted distress. She had simply vanished. Then, 8 months ago, she reappeared on a survey scope, drifting on a trajectory that matched no catalogued origin, fully intact. Bridger Salvage won the recovery bid. I called in 12 years of seniority to put myself on the team. It was not the first job I had taken to outrun an empty cabin. Since Ellen died, I had gotten good at choosing contracts that kept me moving. The docking clamp seated against our hull with a low, decisive shudder. "Atmosphere reads breathable," Dr. Laura Okafor said from the instrument bay behind us. She was the technical authority on the job. A fold space drive specialist Bridger had contracted specifically for the Tartarus because she had helped design the original engine architecture before the Navy, and 3 private contractors turned it into a race. She trusted instruments more than windows, and usually had reason to. Full environmental maintenance. The ship is running life support at standard crew habitation parameters. "For who?" Pete said. Nobody answered. Diane Prescott was already at the airlock controls. The company wanted the Tartarus's navigation data. Functional fold drive coordinates were worth more than the hull and everything welded to it. Prescott understood that better than anyone alive and had reminded us twice during transit. She was brilliant, ambitious, and too honest to pretend ambition was her only motive. Half the fold accidents in the last 20 years had come from people guessing at a map they did not have. Prescott wanted proof the map could exist, even if the proof had come back wearing a nightmare. Ray Kimball stood at the inner airlock door in a fresh suit, with a portable scanner clipped to his chest and too much energy for the confined space. 3rd deep space contract. Competent enough. Eager enough to mistake movement for experience. On day 4 of transit, he had asked what Danny had been like, then apologized before I could answer. That was Ray all over, leaning forward, then realizing too late there might be a drop. The Tartarus's airlock cycled on its side before Prescott triggered ours. A permissive handshake from a ship with no crew. I clipped on my tool harness, checked my headlamp, and told everyone to stay close. The interior corridors were intact and clean. That was the second wrong detail, and it was worse than the first. 10 years of unmanned drift should have left a trace even on a sealed ship. Migrated lubricant, polymer fatigue, dust from slow material breakdown gathering in corners and vent intakes. The Tartarus showed none of it. Her corridors looked maintained, surfaces clean, deck plating clear, conduit housings seated properly in their brackets. Something about the arrangement still felt wrong. Nothing was broken. The whole ship had been reordered. The lighting explained it. Standard corridor illumination on a carrier follows crew logic. Brighter at intersections, dimmer in straightaways, emergency strips along the baseboards. The Tartarus's lights had been rebalanced. Brightness pooled along certain corridors and withdrew from others, creating channels of emphasis that kept nudging the eye aft toward the rear of the ship where the fold space drive housing sat. Walk any corridor and the ship kept pointing the same way, towards the engine. "Something's on the walls," Ray said. He crouched near a junction where two bulkhead sections met and touched the seam with a gloved finger before I could stop him. A clear, faintly luminous fluid had gathered in the join, pooling like condensation in cold plumbing, except the corridor was warm and the fluid carried its own dim light. He lifted his hand. The stuff clung and stretched between glove and wall in a thin filament. "Don't touch unknowns," I said. "Too late," he said, trying for humour. It came out quieter than he meant it to. Okafor collected a sample in a sealed tube and held it under her scanner. "Synthetic. Protein analog base, polymer-laced, mild bioelectric charge. Nothing in the Tartarus's original specifications." She turned the tube slowly in the light. The fluid brightened against the warmth of her hand. "The ship is producing this." "Producing it from what?" Prescott asked. Okafor waited a beat, and that alone got my attention. "Cultured material," she said at last. "Grown, not harvested." Pete glanced at her. "You people build anything that doesn't turn theological after 10 years?" Okafor's mouth tightened. "This didn't come from us." We moved deeper. The plasma, as we started calling it, grew thicker the farther aft we travelled. Thin films on the bulkheads became visible trickles. Seam condensation became shallow pools in deck channels. It caught our lamps and threw prismatic colour across the walls. Ray kept looking at it the way people look at aquarium glass. The worst part was what it did to mood. The tension I had carried since we docked, the animal vigilance of boarding a dead ship that might hold my brother's bones, began to loosen. The corridors felt warm. The air felt held. I caught myself walking at an easy pace and had to force the correction. This was a wreck. These passages had been empty for a decade. Comfort had no place here. "The ship feels glad we're here," Ray said. He said it the way someone comments on temperature, not expecting an answer. The word snagged in me all the same. Glad was too specific. It implied reception. I found Danny's toolkit 20 meters later. It hung at a corridor junction on a wall bracket, not stowed in maintenance where it belonged, but displayed. Each tool had been cleaned. Each one was arranged by size. His service number was etched into the handle of his torque driver, the same way he had marked his gear since he was 16, and losing socket wrenches in our father's garage. I had shown him how to scratch the number shallow first, then deepen it clean so the metal would not burr. Something had taken my brother's working tools and turned them into a reliquary. For one stupid second, I saw him at 15, grinning through a split lip, after he dropped a suspension assembly on his foot and insisting he was fine because Dad was watching. That memory hit harder than the sight of the tools. Pete came up beside me and studied the display without comment. Then he set a hand on my shoulder and left it there long enough to mean something before taking it away. We reached the cargo bay. The equipment was gone. Shipping containers, modular racks, all of it cleared away. Bare deck plates stretched under our lamps, scored with wear patterns I did not understand until Okafor crouched at the nearest set of marks and ran her fingertips along the grooves. "Knees," she said. "Repeated kneeling. Hundreds of impressions." The marks ran in rows, all of them facing the aft bulkhead. The bulkhead itself had been cut open with a plasma torch, not damaged cut, to expose the main power conduit leading toward the fold space drive. The conduit pulsed with slow, travelling surges of light. The cadence looked uncomfortably like breathing. People had knelt on that floor long enough to wear devotion into carbon composite plating. Ray breathed. Jesus. Okafor rose too fast, as if the deck had become unsafe. Something else. Prescott was already scanning the exposed conduit, hunger and disgust fighting openly on her face. "It rerouted power priorities," she said. "The ship gave the drive precedence over everything." "It built a church around the engine," Pete said. Nobody corrected him. We pushed aft. The modified lighting drew us through a sequence of narrowing corridors that grew warmer with every turn. Plasma thickened on the walls and across the deck seams until the ship seemed to sweat around us. We reached the medbay and stopped at the threshold. Someone had rebuilt it. Medical restraint frames, adjustable rigs meant to immobilize patients during surgery in zero gravity, had been unbolted from their operating tables and repositioned upright in rows facing the aft bulkhead. A dozen of them, even spacing, uniform orientation. Their cradle sections were filled with pooled plasma deep enough to submerge a body to the chest. The wall displays had been reprogrammed. They cycled biotelemetry data in continuous loops. Heart rhythms, neural activity, stress hormone readings, all tagged with crew identifiers. The patterns repeated with ritual regularity. Recorded suffering played there in ordered sequence. The medbay had become a chapel. Ray stood in the doorway and wept. This was not panic. Tears ran down his face and he looked almost relieved. They weren't lost, he said. He pointed at the displays as if the conclusion were obvious. They recorded it. They left proof. They got through. Pete moved without hurry and placed himself between Ray and the nearest frame. Prescott stared at Ray, unsettled enough to lose her usual poise. Ray, he blinked at her, tears still falling. Don't you see what this is? I see a room full of restraints, she said. Okafor was studying the displays with a rigid focus that had stopped looking academic. The data loops are edited, she said. Selected peaks, fear, pain, surrender, adaptation. Somebody curated them. Somebody, Pete said. She did not answer. Danny's quarters were one compartment forward. Personal effects had been arranged with care. Photographs mounted beside his bunk. Civilian clothes folded on the mattress. The bed made with a tautness that would have startled anyone who remembered Danny at 19. His journal sat on the pillow. I opened it in the doorway. The early entries were his. Maintenance logs with personal notes, complaints about the food recycler, a sketch of a card game he had invented with another tech, the bored, homesick observations of a young man 6 months into a deep space deployment. He mentioned me once, annoyed that I still sent talk checklists in my messages like he was a trainee. He mentioned Ellen, too, in a line about the lemon bars she had smuggled into my transit bag on my last contract, and how she had slipped him too because she knew I would not share. Then came the fold core breach. At first the entries were terror, cascading failures, alarms, screaming on comms, light in places light should not have been. Then the language changed. The fear stayed, but it took on structure. In later entries, Danny described the breach as an opening, then a lesson, then a threshold. The final entry, written in penmanship so controlled it looked mechanical, described preparing the medbay for those who come after, and expressed hope that the ship would find the right ones. My brother had written his own scripture and left it on his pillow. I closed the journal. For 10 years I had imagined Danny's death as agony because agony was simpler. Agony ended a person. This suggested something worse. He had gone into it persuaded. Prescott called from the adjacent operations room. There was strain in her voice now, and that shook me more than the words. I pocketed the journal and went to her. The navigation terminals were live. The coordinate architecture has been replaced, she said. Her hands moved across the interface with the rapid concentration of someone confronting an answer she did not want to admire. Standard fold space math is gone. The system is indexing root logic against neural states, pain states. It's using recorded human distress as navigational reference. She turned one display toward me. The symbols meant nothing to me. Her fear did. It works, she said. Marcus, the relationships hold. This isn't gibberish or corruption. Someone rebuilt the whole nav system around suffering and got it to solve. Pete's voice cracked over comms from the engineering corridor. The fold core is charging. Slow accumulation. Could have been building for years. The walls were wet with plasma. The aft lights burned warm and steady. The corridor lights leading back to the docking port had begun to dim. We leave, I said. Now. We moved fast. Pete met us at the main junction, and we pushed toward the bow, 5 people walking too quickly through passages that seemed to resist the direction. Plasma slicked the deck seams. The warmth had turned coercive. The ship's displeasure pressed against us from every wall. The airlock would not cycle. Okafor dropped to the nearest terminal and ran diagnostics. "All exterior hatches are sealed," she said. Her voice was precise, clipped, built to keep panic from getting leverage. Then she stopped and read the lockout authority line again. "This command tier doesn't belong to any crew access level. It's new." "The ship promoted itself," Prescott said. Behind us in the medbay, Ray dropped to his knees inside one of the plasma-filled restraint frames and began reciting fold breach parameters in a low, reverent cadence. Temperature values, pressure loads, radiation spikes. His eyes were open. Tears tracked his cheeks. Bliss had hollowed his face into something almost serene. The lights behind us died. Ahead, toward the navigation deck, warm light bloomed and held. The ship was herding us. The navigation deck was a broad semicircular compartment at the vessel's center. The moment we crossed the threshold, armored bulkhead doors slammed shut behind us, hard enough to shake the deck. The main holographic projector activated. The map filled the room. Stellar cartography was gone. In its place, the projection showed nodes of recorded human experience. Each node marked a crew member at a breaking point, a death, a collapse, a surrender, a conversion. Biometric data laced through each one. Lines linked them into routes. Similar agonies clustered into regions. The thing had weather, density, depth. Prescott stared at it with the expression engineers wear when a structure fails in a way that reveals a better design hidden inside the ruin. "It's consistent," she said. "God." Bulkhead partitions slammed up from the floor and walls, slicing the navigation deck into isolated cells. Pete reached for me and the partition caught his wrist, forcing his hand back as the composite slab sealed between us. I heard Okafor shout from her section, then Prescott, their voices muffled by centimeters of armored material and climbing plasma. The replays began. The plasma coating the walls of my cell carried the recording straight through my skin. Memory overrode the present with such fidelity that the distinction between the original event and my body stopped mattering. I was Danny. I was 24, and the fold core was rupturing. Engineering was full of light so dense it felt structural. Bulkheads did not burst. They lost coherence. The crew around me screamed. I screamed. The light reached into my chest and caught hold of something load-bearing and pulled. Time blurred inside the replay. Hours. Days. Longer. I lived Danny's first terror. The blind animal fear, the crew sealing compartments against the light and discovering it already threaded through vents, pooled in water lines, filmed the walls with that luminous secretion. I lived the transition too. The fear remained, but it changed purpose. Dread thickened into awe. He stopped resisting. He started studying. He knelt in the cargo bay with the others and turned his face toward the engine and felt, maybe for the first time in his young and uncertain life, that his pain had location, direction, meaning. The final phase of the replay was peace, a vast, load-bearing peace, a wholeness so complete it made everything before it feel like static. Danny believed with the fullness of a man who had found the answer to a question he had never known how to ask. He arranged his tools. He prepared the medbay. He wrote in the journal with a hand that no longer trembled because nothing inside him trembled anymore. Under that belief, holding it up the way bedrock holds a foundation, was love. Love for the crew who had crossed with him, love for the ship that had carried them there. Love for whoever came next and would need help understanding. I was drowning in my brother's salvation, and it felt like every good thing I had lost arriving all at once. Something seized the back of my suit collar and tore me away. The replay severed. Reality hit like explosive decompression. The cell, the plasma, the armoured walls. Pete had levered part of the partition free with a torn-up section of deck plating and dragged me bodily upright. The loss of Danny's recording convulsed through me. My vision ripped white. Every muscle locked against the absence because what Pete had hauled me out of had not felt like torture. He had torn me away from the first thing that made Danny's death bearable. I hung in his grip and shook and wanted, with a need too deep to pass through thought, to go back, to kneel in the plasma and let that peace close over me again like warm water. Pete held on. "Okafor!" he shouted through the torn partition. "Talk!" Her answer came back tight and controlled. "The ship is comparing us. Each cell is running a different crew sequence and reading our neurological response. It's matching those responses against a target in the nav system." Something shifted in her section, a wet sliding sound. "It wants a specific wound." The partitions changed height, then withdrew halfway. The ship was refining its method, queuing shorter sequences in the plasma, testing for response. Danny's voice surfaced in the ambient audio and said my name. "It's eliminated most of us," Okafor said. She sounded angrier now, and that made her easier to trust. "One of us produces a response profile that almost exactly matches the breach signature the Tartarus is trying to reach again." The nav display nearest me reoriented. A dense cluster of linked nodes brightened. "It's you, Marcus," she said. "The ship wants your grief." The partitions retracted. The four of us stood in the open navigation deck beneath the rotating map. Ray had followed the warm light in behind us, and now knelt in a far corner where plasma had pooled deep around his shins. His lips moved steadily, reciting breach figures under his breath with the comfort of someone saying grace over a familiar table. Pete pulled me away from the brightest concentration of light. Okafor and Prescott joined us. My hands would not close properly. Every few seconds, Danny's piece flashed through me as an afterimage. Each time it faded, the loss opened again. "We kill the core," I said. "Mechanically. Get to engineering. Sever power feeds. Burn the hardware down past self-repair." Okafor studied the system displays from a cautious distance. "The ships sealed the direct corridors between here and engineering. Plasma saturation in those passages is at immersion threshold. Walk through and you're inside it the whole way." "Then I go outside," Pete said. He was already reading the deck layout by eye. The joints, access seams, service trunks, every weak place where a ship connected to itself. EVA along the hull, cut in through external maintenance. "Your suit took abrasion on approach," Okafor said. "Seal integrity's compromised. 90% is still a suit." "There's subdeck access," I said. A maintenance hatch sat recessed in the floor near the aft console bank. "Service crawlways. Tighter, fewer modifications. I can get underneath engineering." "Alone," Pete said. "You come in from outside. I come in from below. 2 vectors." Prescott looked from me to the map, then back to the live nav displays. "If you destroy the core before I can pull the architecture..." "Diane." I did not raise my voice. That was enough. She held my gaze. Fear was there. So was the part of her that could not stop seeing the impossible thing as a problem worth solving. That was not cruelty. It was a navigator's mind confronted with proof. It made her more dangerous, not less. "If this gets out in usable form," I said, "someone builds a cleaner version and calls it progress." Her face changed at that. Recognition, not disagreement. "Stay here," I said. "Monitor jump prep. Slow it if you can. Keep Ray from going deeper." We forced the maintenance hatch. The bolts came reluctantly, one of the first honest signs of age the Tartarus had shown us. Pete drove a shoulder into the panel and popped it free. Below was darkness, conduit bundles, and a thin film of glowing plasma over everything. We moved through the service level to the external airlock, a secondary maintenance port barely big enough for Pete's shoulders. He hauled out his EVA suit from the cache beside the lock, the same suit he had worn on 200 recovery ops, patched so many times the surface looked quilted. He sealed everything but the helmet, then paused. "Can you do it?" he asked. He meant Danny. He meant the replay. He meant the fact that whatever the fold core held, it was the last bridge to my brother. "I'll do what needs doing," I said. Pete watched my hands shake. Then he put on his helmet, sealed the collar ring, and cycled the airlock without another word. I listened until the outer door closed. Then I turned aft and started crawling. The service corridors beneath the main deck had never been meant for people to travel at length. Conduit runs and environmental piping pinched the space down to a channel barely wider than my shoulders. Plasma slicked every surface and turned my headlamp into a smear of broken colour. The heat concentrated there, trapped in the narrowness. Danny's voice reached me 30 metres in. At first it was part of the ambient sound saturating the crawlway, crew fragments leaking through the ship's comm system, terror and devotion and calm instruction braided together. Then his voice separated from the rest, not louder, only closer, tuned to a frequency my body already knew. "Mark!" I stopped moving. Plasma dripped from an overhead coupling and struck my forearm. Warmth pulsed through my skin with the unmistakable emotional charge of recognition. "Mark, you came!" The voice came from ahead, from the direction of engineering, carrying the exact verbal texture I remembered. Danny dropped articles when he got earnest. It had driven our mother crazy. The ship could have built the pattern from recordings. That possibility had no practical value. My body heard my brother and answered before reason had a chance. I kept crawling. The route still matched the schematics I had memorized on the 6-week transit out. Danny's voice led me where the blueprint said to go. The guide was untrustworthy. The direction was right. "Ship tried to tell you gently," he said. "The tools, the journal, the chapel. I asked for that. I didn't want it to hurt more than it had to." I dragged myself through a pinch point where 2 conduit trunks nearly met and plasma smeared across my chest and arms. The warmth deepened. Danny's piece flickered at the edge of my awareness. I shoved it back with brute force. "You're angry," he said. "That's fine. Anger's just grief that hasn't found its shape." The fold core's charging rhythm had become audible now through the deck frame beneath me, a low structural pulse. Pete's voice broke through on the comm, thinned by transmission through the hull. "Marcus, I'm outside." Pete Navarro had done EVA on 140 derelicts in 12 years of salvage work. Later, in the only conversation we ever had about the Tartarus after we got home, he told me the exterior was the worst thing he had ever seen in vacuum. A decade of drift should have weathered the hull, micrometeorite pitting, thermal fractures, radiation bleaching that stripped the coating toward raw alloy. The Tartarus had done something else. It had grown. Ridges and channels ran through the metal in branching networks that looked vascular under suit lamps. Faint traces of luminescence moved through them. The ship's skin had reorganized itself into something like circulation. Beyond the light cone of Pete's lamps, the vacuum around the hull was occupied. Shapes pressed against the space surrounding the Tartarus from a direction that had no clear relation to ordinary geometry. The closest comparison he could find was a hand pressing against stretched membrane from the far side. Helmet systems registered local distortions and anomalous refraction. The suit could not resolve them into objects. Pete did not need help recognizing attention. When he shifted along the hull, the nearest presences shifted with him. He reached the engineering access panel and started cutting. The shapes crowded closer. One pressed hard enough that the hull dimpled inward under force that should not have existed in vacuum. Through the warped steel and the distortion behind it, something approached coherence. A face. Not matter but pressure and bent light wearing an expression disturbingly close to satisfaction. Pete cut faster. By the time he kicked the access plate free, cascades of suit warnings were tripping. Thermal regulation, radiation shielding, structural seal integrity. A shoulder joint failed during entry, and vacuum burned the skin beneath before the emergency membrane inflated to compensate. He got inside anyway. "I'm in," he said over comms, breath already rough. 6 primary feeds, starting disconnection. I heard him from the crawlway below engineering. One more junction, then a vertical access shaft. Danny's voice had grown quieter as I approached. Less argument now than companionship. Waiting. At junction C722, a figure stepped into the corridor ahead of me. It filled the crawlway. A standard Tartarus EVA suit stood upright in a space too cramped to stand upright in. Its helmet brushed the overhead conduits. Its boots rested in pooled plasma. Something occupied it. Behind the faceplate, luminous fluid circulated in slow, complex patterns that suggested features without settling into them. A jaw formed, dissolved, gathered into a brow. An eye socket almost resolved, then collapsed into a cheekbone. Its joints had fused with tools. A torque driver replaced the left wrist. 3 fingers on the right hand had become a probe assembly. A diagnostic scanner bulged from the chest where a life support module should have been. A crew composite. Hardware and gathered plasma wearing a dead person's suit. It stepped aside to let me pass. The motion was courteous. "The core is not machinery," it said in a voice stitched from multiple crew recordings. The grammar was intact. The music of speech was ruined. "The core is a wound. You do not repair a wound with tools. The hardware formed around the opening." I squeezed past it. The suit surface was warm and slick. Through my sleeve, where my arm pressed against its chest plate, I felt the fold core's deep rhythm. It did not try to stop me. It kept talking to the space behind me. You heal the wound or you pass through. There is no third interaction. I reached the vertical shaft and climbed. Other composites moved through adjoining passages, visible through gaps in conduit housings. All of them were heading forward, toward the navigation deck, toward Okafor and Prescott and Ray. They moved with the calm, proprietary gait of crew members walking familiar duty routes, missionaries of the breach. I pulled myself into the engineering bay. Pete was slumped against the starboard bulkhead, damaged suit leaking sealant from the shoulder seam, blood drying in narrow tracks from his nose and one ear. 3 of the 6 primary feeds to the fold core had already been severed. He was still working. 4 and 5 are behind the housing, he said. Need another set of hands. I moved to join him, and the fold core stopped me. The housing dominated the center of engineering, a reinforced cylindrical chamber built to contain the most energetic drive system human engineering had ever produced. The housing itself remained intact. What it contained had changed. Through the observation port, the fold space apparatus was still visible. Containment rings, field generators, all the intricate hardware designed to compress space-time into transit geometry. But the machinery was submerged inside a sphere of compressed radiance and living plasma that swelled and contracted in a slow respiratory cycle. The hardware floated within it like bones inside an organ. Inside that light, I could see through. No projection, no display, an aperture. The boundary between ordinary space and whatever the Tartarus had ruptured was tissue-thin there. Beyond it lay a landscape shaped by intensity instead of matter. Regions shaded into one another according to the quality and force of pain. Pressure systems moved across it like weather. It had depth, horizon, scale, and at the nearest edge, just beyond the boundary, stood Danny. Maintenance coveralls, narrow shoulders, weight settled on the left foot because of the soccer injury he had never fully rehabbed. His face was his. His expression was his. He looked at me the way he had looked back from the far end of a dock when we were kids, waiting to make sure I was coming. Pete grabbed my arm. "Marcus, feeds!" Danny lifted one hand, palm open. The fold core breathed. I tore my eyes from the port and picked up Pete's conduit cutter. We worked the 4th feed together. The cable entered the housing through a shielded junction bolted to the deck behind the chamber. Pete braced the housing while I drove the cutter through layered shielding, copper, insulation. The feed snapped apart in a wash of sparks. Inside the port, the sphere of light faltered. The 5th feed ran overhead. I climbed the housing ladder while Pete held the base steady. His breathing came through the comm in short, labouring pulls. Sealant continued to weep from his shoulder seam. The cutter chewed through the fifth feed slower than I liked. When it finally parted, engineering dropped to emergency lighting, and the housing shuddered hard enough to rattle the ladder under my boots. The sphere inside the core contracted violently, then surged again, trying to pull itself back together. One feed remained. Pete was already moving for it when a crew composite stepped out of the corridor behind him and laid a hand on his shoulder. Pete spun. The composite held a maintenance wrench toward him, handle first, as politely as one tech offering another the proper tool across a bench. Wrong tool. The wrench fit the service bolts that would secure the junction, not destroy it. Pete knocked it aside. More composites came in. They emerged from every access point in the bay. Corridors, service hatches, even openings that looked too tight for a suited body. 6, 7. They moved around the equipment, carrying tools in fused hands. Their voices overlapped in fragments of procedure and devotion, guiding, advising, urging patience with the solicitous tone of veteran crew helping newcomers orient on shift. One composite crouched beside the fourth feed and began repairing what I had cut. Its altered fingers worked with terrifying competence. Another moved for the third feed. They answered damage with maintenance. Pete severed the sixth feed. A composite caught the two cut ends and held them together through its own body. Current arced through the suit frame. The faceplate lit from within. The feed stayed live. "They're bridging it," Pete said. "I cut. They hold." Danny's voice filled the bay. "Mark, you don't have to do this." The composites parted for me as I moved back toward the observation port. They were not blocking. They were welcoming. Through the port, Danny stood with the suffering country behind him, huge and terrible and real. "The crew is here," he said. "All of us. Conscious. We remember, we adapted. Pain is the physics of this place, that's all. It isn't punishment. It's what the world is made of here, the way gravity is what yours is made of. We learned to move in it." His hand touched the inner side of the impossible boundary, as if glass separated us. I remember Dad's shop. I remember Deck 9. I remember Ellen sneaking me lemon bars because she knew you'd hoard them. I remember everything. I pressed my palm against the warm observation port. "Destroying the core doesn't kill us," Danny said. "We're already through, but it seals the wound. No bridge, no contact. Nothing changes after that." Okafor's voice burst over comms from the navigation deck. "Marcus, the composites have Ray in a restraint frame. He went willingly. Prescott's fighting them with a suppression canister, but the nav system is computing a jump. Ray's not ideal, but he may be enough." Pete cut another repaired line. A composite replaced the connection with its own body. Another was already improvising a bypass with conductive plasma and stripped cable. "We can't beat this on labor," Pete said. "Too many hands." I looked at the housing. Inside the maintenance crawl space between the outer shell and the fold boundary sat the manual containment vents, 3 mechanical valves designed as a catastrophic last resort. Open all 3, and the fold energy dump would burn out the core and the reactor shielding together. The crawl space was fully immersed in active plasma. Anyone going in would be in direct contact with the boundary layer. No suit, no partition, no buffer. The ship wanted my mind intact. It had already identified me as its best route. That was the only margin I had. "I'm going in," I said. Pete crossed the distance between us in 2 steps and caught my forearm. His grip held refusal, rage, acceptance, grief, everything he never said because saying it never changed the job. I pulled free. His hand hung in the air a fraction too long before dropping. Then Pete turned and went back to cutting, because his answer to unbearable things had always been work. I released the clamps on the housing access panel with my bare hands and swung the hatch open. The interior hit me like a wave. The crawl space was barely 60 centimeters wide, lined with conduit, manual valve assemblies, and luminous plasma from floor to ceiling. It closed over me the moment I pulled myself inside. Warmer than blood. It soaked through my clothes, filled every gap between fabric and skin, erased the boundary between my body and the thing pressing against the containment wall. The suffering dimension stopped being a sight through glass. Its pressure was on my skin, in my nerves, threaded through my thoughts. I could feel what Prescott had only described. Not the equations, but the orientation behind them. Loss had direction there. Specific grief pointed towards specific places. Thinking about Danny gave me a bearing as exact as muscle memory. I crawled. The first valve sat low in the housing wall 2 meters ahead, a heavy manual wheel stiff from long disuse. I gripped it with both hands. The ship made its final argument. Ellen. The plasma delivered a sensory record sourced from somewhere real. Station cameras, incident logs, archived telemetry. The Tartarus had gone looking through human systems for the wound that matched me, and it had found her. The breach alarm on the mining platform. Ellen turning toward the sound at her station. A port bulkhead seal failing under load. Decompression beginning as a whistle and becoming a roar. Ellen driving herself toward the emergency controls with that focused, practical ferocity she brought to everything. The station camera caught her face. I had never watched the footage. 3 years since her death, and I had never opened the file. I had not been able to bear terror on her face. What I feared most was something worse. That her last expression would be concentration, competence. The self I knew too well to survive seeing in the moment it failed. It was concentration. Pure problem-solving attention. She was measuring distance, force, handholds. She was trying to solve the room. She almost reached the panel. She lost her grip 7 seconds short. Ellen died working the problem. The ship showed me where what remained of that effort had gone. The suffering country held no bodies, no souls in any vocabulary I trusted. It held residue, pattern, continuance of another kind. The preserved configuration of anguish at the moment of violent ending. Enough of her remained in that pattern to be recognizable. Enough of Danny remained in his. Something persisted. The offer followed naturally. Come through. Walk the landscape your grief already knew how to read. Find Danny waiting at the near edge. Find Ellen's pattern in the weather and the pressure and kneel beside it. Give love a destination. Give guilt a place to go. My hands were already turning the first valve. I stopped. The seduction was total because it was true in every way that mattered. The dimension existed. Danny persisted there in some form. Ellen's final configuration had been caught there too. The root logic worked. The ship was telling the truth. It was telling a partial truth. I had spent 12 years boarding crippled vessels. I knew how dying systems behaved. A reactor in cascade failure holds green longer than it should to keep the engineer at the console. A decompression alarm suppresses bad data because the network wants continuity more than accuracy. Corrupt navigation throws confident headings because confidence keeps the pilot committed. Machines do not need malice to become lethal. They only need a goal. The Tartarus was doing what every failing system does. It was making my presence feel necessary. It was using love instead of warning lights. It did not care whether I reached Danny. It cared that my grief could function as a heading. Everything else was sails. I turned the first valve open. The housing shuddered. "Mark," Danny said from everywhere at once. "Please." The second valve sat higher along the wall. I pulled myself forward through the plasma, face drenched, body thrumming with the retreating pressure of that vast place. Danny's voice was losing coherence already, breaking into fragments, stitched recordings separating at the seams. "Mark, don't we door." I opened the second valve. Containment energy vented into the reactor shielding. A rising structural groan climbed through the ship frame. The plasma in the bay beyond began to lose its light, draining from the edges inward. Over comms, Okafor said the map was collapsing. Prescott said the composites were dropping. Ray had gone limp. The third valve lay at the far end of the crawl space where the containment ring met the reactor interface. Deepest point, strongest saturation. I crawled toward it through fluid that was already cooling. Danny's voice stopped. The pressure of the suffering country weakened against the housing wall. It was pulling away, tide leaving stone. I reached the third valve and set my hands on the wheel. For one fraction of a second before the core died, the ship used me. The remaining active plasma on my skin carried enough charge for the failing drive to read me the way a scanner reads a code. Automatic, impersonal, complete. The fold core fired for a microsecond. In that instant, it took the exact shape of my grief and solved for destination. Danny's location, Ellen's pattern, a route expressed in the structure of everything I had failed to keep. Then I opened the valve. The containment sphere collapsed inward. Light fragmented, failed, went dark. Across the Tartarus, the plasma lost warmth and intelligence and became only fluid, grey, cooling, purposeless. Outside the hull, Pete would later say, the presences peeled away from the membrane of the world, like pressure lifting from stretched skin. The wound sealed. I crawled out of the housing soaked and shaking. Pete hauled me upright. Engineering was dark and ordinary now. Cables, dead equipment, inert fluid, the soft clatter of empty suits collapsed around their tools. Through the observation port, there was nothing at all. Danny was gone. The airlocks opened. Every sealed hatch on the Tartarus cycled to permissive status. Corridor lights defaulted to standard emergency levels. Without the fold core, without the active plasma chemistry, the ship was only infrastructure again. A carrier hull, with functioning life support and conventional power systems. A salvageable wreck. That was what it had been supposed to be. We collected Okafor and Prescott from the navigation deck. The projector was dark. The map was gone. Grey fluid pooled in shallow sheets across the floor. Ray walked when we guided him. He turned his head when we said his name. He obeyed instructions one at a time. Step here, duck here, hold the rail, like a man operating from the outermost layer of himself. The conversion had gone out with the plasma and taken something with it on the way. Prescott kept one hand on his arm the whole trip back to the dock. He accepted the contact without visible response. I carried Danny's journal inside my suit. We crossed to the shuttle. The Tartarus released the docking clamps without resistance. Pete powered up from the co-pilot seat with hands that shook from blood loss, fatigue, and partial vacuum exposure. Okafor ran contamination screens on all 5 of us. The plasma read as complex synthetic residue with no active biological or energetic signature. Our blood work looked like what it was. People who had been scared half to death and dragged back. Prescott laid in the return course to the support vessel. She worked the controls, then sat staring at the nav display after the route locked. She could reconstruct parts of what she had seen. I knew it. She knew it. Whether that knowledge would die in her conscience or surface one day in a white paper, a private consultation, an engineered euphemism for the same obscenity, I could not tell from her face. She had crossed too much ground inside herself to be readable. Okafor dressed Pete's shoulder and did it more gently than I had expected. When she finished, she sat back on the med bench and looked at her own hands for a long time. She had helped build the family of machines that made the Tartarus possible. She had not built this. The distinction did not seem to comfort her. Pete closed his eyes in the co-pilot's seat. After 9 years beside him, I knew every kind of his silence. This one belonged to a man who had done exactly what the job required and would carry the cost without discussion, because discussion did not redistribute weight. He would never bring up the Tartarus unless I did. I would never bring it up first. I sat in the aft compartment with Danny's journal closed in my hands. During that last microsecond inside the housing, the dying drive had burned a solution into me. Something bodily. a direction with no ordinary geometry attached to it. When I thought about Danny, the pull sharpened. When I thought about Ellen, it resolved more cleanly still. The feeling was indistinguishable from grief itself, except for one added cruelty. Grief now had orientation. The dimension was sealed. The core was dead. That route was gone to every ship that would ever come after. But I knew the way. I would know it for the rest of my life. Every anniversary, every empty chair. Every morning my hand reached across a bed for warmth that was not there. Every time somebody laughed with a cadence that caught on Danny's voice for a second, before turning into someone else's. The bearing would return. The distance would seem to clarify. I would feel, somewhere behind the sternum and under the ribs, the exact heading to a country made of pain where the people I loved still persisted in whatever form that place allowed, standing at the boundary, looking back as if waiting for me to catch up. I closed the journal. I told no one.